So I wanted to offer one view of rhetoric as we begin our discussion of rhetoric this week. Now, rhetoric, in terms of my definition, is the study and practice of effective communication. Now, in terms of effective, what I mean is that the act of communication produces the intended or the expected result. But what are the results of, or the potential results of any act of communication? The ends that it brings about could be to connect, to inform, to participate, to identify with another person, to persuade another person. So, rhetoric again then would be just an act of communication that connects with another person, that informs another person, that participates in some conversation, that identifies with another person, or that seeks to persuade another person to a particular point of view. Now, there are four main components of what we call the rhetorical situation. Now, the rhetorical situation is any set of circumstances that involves at least one person using some sort of communication to modify the perspective of at least one other person. So any act of communication can involve rhetoric. Now, again, like I mentioned, a rhetorical situation involves four main parts. We have the speaker, audience, subject, and context. Now, each of these, the first three aspects of the rhetorical situation are bound up in what Aristotle gave us as rhetorical strategies. He called them ethos, pathos, logos. And I'll speak to those briefly as I go through each of these. Now, the speaker is bound up in the rhetorical strategy known as ethos, which is the ethical appeal. It's based on the character or the credibility or the reliability of the writer or the person who is carrying out the act of communication. So when you're making an ethical appeal, you are appealing to your credibility as a writer, or you are looking for the credibility of the person who is doing the writing. And you're trying to be as reliable, as responsible as possible. Now, this is bound up in your purpose as a writer, your attitude as a speaker, and your background. Those are things you can look at and consider when you are considering the aspect of the speaker in any rhetorical situation and considering any ethical strategies the person might be using. Then we move to the audience. Every act of communication obviously needs a speaker, but it also needs an audience. Now, when someone is appealing to an audience, that is what is called the pathetic appeal or appeal to pathos. It's the emotional appeal. It's reaching out to an audience's needs, values, and emotional sensibilities, trying to touch them. Emotional appeals are often bound up in, they are often evoked with strong music, etc. Stories that just help us to feel something. So that's the emotional appeal. And when you're considering the emotional appeal or considering audience, you're going to want to look at the audience's purpose for being in the act of communication, for receiving it, their attitude, and their background. So same as with the speaker. Now, just as every act of communication needs a speaker and an audience, it also requires a subject or a text. What is being spoken about? In terms of the rhetorical strategy, this is logos, or the logical appeal, the appeal to reason. Relies, again, on logic or reason. So it's how logical am I being? How logical is this speaker being? Trying to tease out the flow of logic in any act of communication. Things to consider in terms of the logical appeal or the subject are what medium is this subject or is this text coming at me from or via? Is it in writing solely? Is it audio only? Can I only hear it? Can I hear it and see it? So is it video? So you're going to want to consider all aspects of the media in which the subject is being delivered and received. Within that is bound up the idea of the tools that are used to make this subject or the text and the tools that are used to decipher that text. So those things you want to consider when you're looking at the text or the subject of any rhetorical situation. Now, outside of all of those, in addition to both speaker, audience, and subject, we have the context. It's extremely important to consider the context of any act of communication, the environment and setting in which it takes place. in terms of time, place, community, conversation, because the context matters. That can determine what we say, how we say it, and so many other things. Now, when we put all of these together, I put them together in a Venn diagram because I think it gives a good indication of how these things, how these different aspects overlap with and interact with each other in the rhetorical situation. We have the speaker, again, ethos, subject, audience, and and with all of that, around that we have the context, and where they all come together, right in the middle, where all of these circles overlap in this Venn diagram, we have could be called the rhetorical triangle or the rhetorical stance. That's what Wayne Booth calls it. Now, this is where effective communication happens. This is where all of these things come together, and we are really zooming on all cylinders in our active communication, to use that sort of a strained metaphor there. Now, the rhetorical, well, in terms of two scholars who've spoken about this, we have Judith Clayton Vann, who is an English professor. She said that every communication is essentially a trilateral relationship. Each point of this triangle, the speaker, audience, and subject, influences the others, and all are influenced by the context of the communication. Each point of the triangle bears some responsibility for the success of the communication, and each point of the triangle corresponds with one of Aristotle's three appeals. In other words, his general means of persuasion. Again, ethos, logos, pathos. Now that's in terms of the rhetorical triangle. I personally like the notion of the rhetorical stance because it feels a bit more free-flowing, although Booth is even hesitant to call it a stance. Now this stance depends on discovering and maintaining in any writing situation or any active communication a proper balance among the three elements that are at work in any communicative effort: the available arguments about the subject itself, the interest and peculiarities of the audience, and the voice, the implied character of the speaker. So again, where we have all of those things coming together, we have the rhetorical situation. And this is, again, where effective communication happens. Now, rhetoric is one way of looking at, it's a very powerful way of considering any active communication. And it's something to keep in mind as not only as you are making language, but as you are receiving language. You can consider all of these things. What is this speaker doing? How is he or she delivering this message, the subject? How am I receiving this message? What is the message? In what context are we acting here? And what limitations are placed on this act of communication in terms of the context? How would this act of communication be different if it were outside of this context? So we can consider any number of these things as we are looking at any active rhetorical situation.